So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the last session of today before the evening exciting reception. So I know it's been a long day and there have been lots of talks and lots to think about. But we have a very exciting panel here for you this evening. And I'll just very briefly introduce the panelists, three of whom are here with us in person. So first we have Jan van Weeren from the Stichting OverBevolking Institute, or it's, I guess, a foundation. We have Emma Engström from the Institute for Future Studies in Sweden. And we have Tobias Rüttenauer from University College London. And then we have two speakers online with us, two panelists online. We have Dean Spears from the University of Texas at Austin. And we have Lisa Thalheimer from the United Nations University. So the way the panel is going to function is each of our panelists will present for about 5 to 7 minutes at most, just reflecting on how their research informs this topic. And then we want to have quite a lively discussion with the audience and with the panelists on this topic, very important topic of population and greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah? So without further ado, I will invite our first panelist. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, dominant narrative is that population growth is not a problem for climate change because population is mainly growing in poor countries whose contribution to global emissions is negligible. Population growth is only a fallacious distraction from the real cause of emission increase, that is overconsumption in rich countries. An underlying assumption of this claim is that the world can be divided into rich and poor countries. This is a simplification of reality, as countries are commonly divided into 4 categories. No. That one. We have low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and high-income countries. An analysis carried out by Lucia Tamburino, still in press, over the years 1992, it's the year of the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, until 2018, reveals that the interaction of per capita emissions and population growth in upper middle and lower middle income countries has contributed greatly to the sum total of CO2 emissions. The population growth is a main driver of CO2 emissions, is acknowledged also by the International Panel on Climate Change. In their last report this year, they wrote, globally, gross domestic product, GDP per capita and population growth remained the strongest driver of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion in the last decade. It's remarkable that this information has been censored and removed from the summary for policymakers. It's almost like John Cleese's famous ban in Fawlty Towers, don't mention the war, don't mention the population. The question is, can we address the environmental problems caused by overconsumption and pollution without tackling population size? Well, let's assume that we will start to cut down consumption levels. How far should we go? It's a no-brainer that we should strive for a basic level of welfare for all people in the world. But how do we define such a basic level? Lucia Tamburino and Giangiacomo Bravo came up with the Human Development Index of the United Nations. The Human Development Index, or HDI, summarizes key dimensions of human development, such as life expectancy, years of schooling, and the gross national income per capita. The scores for these dimensions are aggregated into an index ranging from 1 to 0. The HDI is a measure of general welfare and not an index of material wealth. It is calculated for 189 countries in the world, and Norway, of course, has the highest HDI, and Niger the lowest. Tamburino and Bravo took an HDI of 0.7 as a minimal level of welfare. Almost 2/3 of all countries have a higher HDI, 1/3 a lower index. Near the cutoff score of 0.7, we find countries such as Egypt, Indonesia, and Vietnam. In Western eyes, these countries have a very modest standard of welfare. There is a strong correlation between the HDI and the ecological footprint. The ecological footprint is a robust measure for human impact on the environment. The dominant part of it is the carbon footprint. The correlated per capita footprint of an HDI of 0.7 is about 2.14 global hectares. However, the bad news is that there's only 1.6 global hectare available per person with the present world population. This means that even if we would accept a minimal HDI of 0.7 for every world citizen, we would still have a serious deficit of global hectares. What can we do to bridge this gap? Ecological overshoot is a global problem, but ecological reserves and ecological deficits are unequally distributed over the world. There are green countries on the map that could offer their inhabitants an adequate HDI with the associated footprint without an ecological overshoot, such as Canada, almost all countries in South America, Scandinavia, Russia, and Australia, but also Congo, Namibia, and even Madagascar. These countries all have an ecological reserve which is big enough to accommodate all of their inhabitants in accordance with an HDI of 0.7. Then there are blue countries on the map that could live in accordance with an HDI of 0.7 within their ecological boundaries by reducing their per capita footprint. Examples are the USA, France, Ireland, and Austria. A third category of orange countries, however, will not be able to do this. Even if they would adjust to an HDI of 0.7 and the associated footprint, they still would cross their ecological boundaries with their present populations. Examples are most countries in Africa, the entire Middle East, Pakistan, India, China, and the Caribbean, but also many European countries, such as the UK, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Switzerland, Italy, and Greece. Even if these countries would try to return to their ecological boundaries by reducing their per capita footprints to the size associated with the set HDI of 0.7, they would still accommodate too many people to achieve that goal. Well, I have three conclusions from this. We cannot downplay the population dimension when discussing the environment impact caused by greenhouse gas emission. And secondly, even if we would return to a very modest welfare level, we would still be in ecological overshoot in many high and middle income countries with their present populations. And third, we cannot create a basic welfare level in low income countries without surpassing their ecological boundaries given their present populations. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I know there's going to be a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask you to maybe hold those questions because we want to hear from all the speakers first and then have a discussion after. So our second speaker is Dean Spears, and please go ahead, Dean. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person and enjoying all the interactions that we'd be able to have if we did that. It, amongst other considerations, would be a large carbon footprint to fly over, but I wish I could have joined you. In general, when I talk with people about the size of the human population, not everybody knows that within the lifetime of children born today, the size of the population is projected to peak and population growth is projected to be negative. Different projections from different organizations disagree about the details, though, but about that big picture fact, there's a lot of agreement because total fertility rates are falling. This is not a room where that's going to be a surprising bit of revelation, but it is an important starting point. And so then, a sort of pragmatic question would be, how, if at all, should policy respond to this? Is this a policy issue in any way? And in particular, how does it interact with climate policy, and especially with climate mitigation policy, with the policy, social, economic, political, and moral imperative to decarbonize and reduce carbon emissions? My view is that as important as the projected and coming depopulation may be, and as important as climate change is, that we should not think that there's any sort of ready policy option available to us whereby accelerating depopulation or trying to reduce fertility rates is a plausible or pragmatic policy response to climate change, or in particular would be a useful source of carbon dioxide emissions reductions. I'm going to give three thoughts about that. One sort of comes from my own research where I work on children's health in India. And the thing that I have studied the most is child height and infant mortality in rural India like Uttar Pradesh, which is a place where there's a lot of open defecation, meaning that people defecate in the open without using a toilet or latrine. There's less than there used to be, but there's more than in other even poorer developed countries, like in Bangladesh or sub-Saharan Africa. And there's evidence in the literature that this is one reason why early life health in India is worse than it is in other poorer developing countries. Children, for example, are shorter and neonatal mortality rates are higher. The point here isn't to discuss all of that. The point is to notice that the children in a place like Uttar Pradesh face a double threat from open defecation because there's a high density of open defecation, a high population density of open defecators. And if you plot what predicts child height, for example, or early life mortality rates, it's really the density of open defecators per square kilometer. And so since Uttar Pradesh, for example, is a place with both high population density and a lot of open defecation, children tend to be living near other people who defecate in the open, which means that they're especially likely to be exposed to fecal germs. Bangladesh. Okay, and so right, and so there's an important correlation there between population density and this polluting outcome that harms people, the density of open defecation, just like we were hearing earlier about the important correlation between population size and aggregate carbon emissions. Then the policy question is, do we conclude from that and from the importance of reducing exposure to open defecation, that we should be doing some sort of population or fertility policy and making the density of the population in Uttar Pradesh lower so that children are surrounded by fewer people defecating in the open? And to me, the answer is obviously no, that the policy recommendation is to work very hard to reduce people's exposure to open defecation by accelerating the transition to the use of safe sanitation on toilets or latrines. And, one way to see that is to compare India with Bangladesh, where even though population density is greater, exposure to open defecation is much lower and children's health is better because so few people defecate in the open. And, it is something that changes over time and could be improved by the right type of policy investment. And so my analogy here is that there are a number of problems that scale in the density of the population or the number of people exposed to them. But that doesn't necessarily imply that the right policy lever to tackle those problems is fertility policy or otherwise trying to change the size of the population. If we think of the iPad equation of impact as, population size multiplied by scaling factors, maybe those scaling factors are the right way to try to change the aggregate impact, such as, for example, reducing exposure to open defecation by changing people's open defecation behavior. Now, I'm supposed to be talking about climate emissions here, and so let me pull back from my analogy and ask, what does this imply then about fertility policy as a climate mitigation policy? And here, I think if you think of, multiplying population size times emissions per person, and asking whether population size, changing the size of the population is a good way to change the overall stock of emissions. I think a very important fact here is timing, and in particularly the timing involved in population momentum. The growth rate of the human population is already shrinking and is projected to turn negative within the lifetime of people alive today. So the question is, could any sort of feasible policy accelerate that on the timeline relative to climate emissions? And I think we all are here because we recognize the urgency of decarbonization, and at the level of just the next very few decades, needing to develop and implement, and through political and technological and economic and social changes, vastly accelerating decarbonization. And I think that what the demography and population science of population momentum tells us is that population size is simply too slow turning of a ship in order to have that big of an effect on aggregate carbon emissions within the urgent time period that the climate scientists tell us is relevant. You can look at these population projections where you hypothetically impose large changes in fertility rates, and even still, when you track forward the projection, several decades into the future, the overall difference in the size of the human population is not very great. Which suggests that it's might not be an effective way. Which suggests that it'd just be too late. That it's not. That changes in the size of the population couldn't possibly match the urgency of the decarbonization problem. And for my last small point, I just want to say, thinking more broadly back about how we should understand the future of global human depopulation. I think there's just a lot that we don't know. I think that the climate policy world has been correct to understand that, the tail risks, as Marty Weitzman put it, of climate damages are part of the most important part of understanding the social cost of carbon, the part that we don't know, the small probabilities of a big risk. And I think, we're not there yet on understanding the unknowns and the tail risks of a depopulating world. The economists who study endogenous growth tell us that population size is important for technological production, technological ideas and innovation. We know that there are scale effects in a variety of economic ways due to specialization in trade and fixed costs. It would be silly or crazy for me or anyone else to say what they know would, an advanced economy that's, what would be possible for an advanced economy where the whole world is 1 billion people and shrinking. I think it's a question that we should be thinking about because just like exponential
Sorry, Dean, can you come to an end,
fast.
please? You're far above your time slot, so maybe just the concluding sentence.
Sure. This is my final sentence. Just as economic growth, just as population growth happened very fast, depopulation at the level of centuries, but not decades, could happen fast too. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Dean. Our next speaker is Emma Engstrom from the Institute for Future Studies.
Excuse me, how do I switch? I use this. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dean. I will present our study quite briefly. And I noticed that Dean was mentioning the IPAD equation, and this study is all about the IPAD equation. So I'm not a demographer myself, but my co-author Martin Kolk is a demographer, and we're looking at the IPAD from a new perspective, and we call the study "When Can Environmental Impacts Be Mitigated Through Changes in Population and Affluence?" And we compare IPADs for climate change and land use change. And this is what the identity looks like. It's basically showing that environmental impacts relate to population, affluence, and technology, which is basically impact per unit of production. So this was from the 1970s, and we revisit it because we think it's instructive to look at these urgent problems. And basically what we want to do, we want to use very much baseline projections. So we don't want to come up with any projections of our own. We rely on IPCC's models and VPP 2022 recent updates. And we review the literature for historical developments in terms of carbon emissions per unit of GDP. And here is where we think there are interesting differences across the two planetary boundaries. And I don't know if you recognize this picture, but it's from the Stefan et al. Study on planetary boundaries, and we focus on two of these. So it's not only climate change, but they emphasize land systems change in addition to biosphere integrity and eco-geochemical impacts or flows. And we are interested in two of these. And land use, we call it land use, but we basically talk about land systems change, and it's important because it relates also to biosphere integrity. And both, especially land use, relate heavily to agriculture. So here are some of our results. They show this IPAD in two different ways, and they look very similar, but there is a distinct difference. And the difference is in the yellow line, which is impact in 2100, and because the blue and the red ones are the same. That's the assumptions for affluence and population growth. But so we use the kind of baseline scenario for climate impact, which is SSP2. And we can see that even that scenario is better than land use in 2100, and this is a kind of optimistic number that we use. We scan the literature, and the best kind of number we find, the most optimistic projection is this, that land use impacts will not be significantly reduced by 2100. And so it's notable here that in this IPAD framework, it shows that IPCC's baseline scenario is still showing very optimistic views on technology. So even if we continue as business as usual, according to IPCC, we'll be doing pretty well, but nevertheless not enough, because according to this projection, we will get to a 2.5 increase in global temperature. So we show that, reduction in impacts is not sufficient in land use particularly. And just to conclude this approach, we are more detailed in the paper, of course, but the final notes is basically we review this concept which was introduced in the 70s. And the founders of this idea, Ehrlich and Holdren, they argued that population growth and affluence growth were hugely problematic, and they didn't see really any prospect in this T. But in some regards, they have been proven wrong, right? Like there are some environmental impacts that have really kind of been reduced, even as populations have been increasing, and affluence as well. And there are some contemporary environmentalists, they focus on degrowth, and that means basically they think that A should be kept constant. Whereas green growth, if you're in that camp, you're basically focusing very much on T. And you have high hopes, given that affluence is expected to increase as population, not as much as affluence, but nevertheless. So you will have to have pretty high hopes for this T. And we illustrate this in the paper. And we argue in the end that population and affluence, like policies that address those two, could be more relevant in terms of land use than climate change. So we're sort of agreeing with Dean Spears in terms of climate change we need to address it with other means. I guess we believe in the T then. And that's the final comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Next we have Tobias from UCL.
All right, thank you very much. So I think what I'm going to present is a bit of a different angle on that topic of population and greenhouse gas emissions. It's basically a study that deals with how extreme weather events and how climate change affects people's attitudes and their behavior. And in general, the basic idea, or the starting point that I had when I started this project is, well, when we look at like attitudes and behavior of people 10 years ago, what we actually find is that there aren't that many people who are horribly worried about climate change. So if you ask them, are you worried about climate change? Actually, a majority says, well, not that much. Which is kind of odd, right? Because even right now we see that climate change is happening and we should be worried. However, then the question is, okay, if people don't behave very environmentally friendly, and we know that climate change impacts will increase, that also extreme weather events will increase, we could think maybe the problem will solve itself. And I don't mean that by just people like dying because of extreme weather events, but because people seeing extreme weather events, seeing climate change happening, and thus changing their behavior. So I want to know here in this project whether the exposure to extreme weather events, whether that increases people's belief in climate change and also their pro-environmental behavior. What this study does is basically, we use an individual level household panel data set in the UK, so that's the Understanding Society data set, which is like, we observe the same people multiple times, and we have a time window of 10 years, and people were asked about their concerns about climate change and also some measures of pro-environmental behavior, which includes like sustainable shopping, turning down the heating system, but also mobility behavior, like using a bicycle rather than a car, for instance. And we can connect like where people live to other data sets like DEFRA's Recorded Flood Outlines database, which basically records for every part in the UK, or in this case it's only England actually, on a given day which areas have been flooded. So we can kind of like say, well, around the area of a person, like the residence of a person, within 1 kilometer has there been a flood, and what I define as a flood event here is if we have at least something like two football fields that have been flooded. We can obviously do the same with weather data as well, that we kind of say, well, if we have at least 29 degrees Celsius or higher for 3 consecutive days, that in the UK actually counts as a heat wave, we measure whether people were exposed to this sort of heat wave. And then we see whether that influences, if a person has been affected, does that influence people's attitudes towards climate change, and does it also affect their behavior? What we find in the study is, yes, we find an effect of proximate floods and proximate heat waves on people's attitudes. If people are affected by an extreme weather event, they say, well, I'm more concerned about climate change than they said before they were affected by this extreme weather event. That kind of means, yeah, maybe the problem solves itself, that people are getting more concerned and more environmentally friendly, or like more environmental consciousness. But then when you look at the behavior indicator that we use here, there's just nothing. So there's basically, if people are affected by a flood in their residential area, if people are affected by a heat wave, they just continue as they did before. And we can use different, it's all self-reported, but we can use different sorts of measures, as also transportation, commuting behavior, nothing changes. And that, I think, is a bit of a frustrating result, in the sense that behavior is very consistent and it's hard to change, I think. And even like personally experiencing climate change doesn't induce behavioral changes, which I think is a bit of a frustrating picture about like how well we could change people's behavior and mitigate climate change in that way. So I think, I mean, one thing I have to say, it's only until 2019, so I mean, these new movements of Fridays for the Future, for instance, are not included in this study here. So maybe there's a moment at the moment where we could actually expect people to be a bit more willing to change their behavior, but we don't know. But still, I think we need also policies, and we need I don't know, taxes and price incentives for people to change their behavior. Otherwise, we won't make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean. And now our last panelist, who's also online, Lisa Thalheimer from the United Nations University. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see my screen, which I'll shortly put in presentation mode if technology allows. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Raya Mutarak, for inviting me, and it's a huge honor to be also on this panel with you, Wolfgang. I know it's your last time, so to say, and it's a really great honor. So today, I would like to present a bit of research informed by climate science, but also by my time at YASA in 2020 during the YSSP program, and also during my postdoc at Princeton. Yeah, I think we've all seen it in the media that there is a huge debate on so-called climate refugees, whether this is a thing, whether this is not a thing. We see actually a lot of the media covering large-scale displacement flows and having these really dramatic pictures and linking this directly to climate change. Putting usually causal statements such as climate change has led to migration or has led to displacement or refugee flows. And this is really kind of the motivation of my research. At the same time, I work with climate scientists from the World Weather Attribution, where we look at the impacts from extreme weather events, but also at the role of anthropogenic climate change. So here we ask, how much more likely has an extreme weather event such as a drought, a flood, or heat waves become due to the changed amount of atmospheres due to the increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And what's really interesting is that it's not always climate change that drives, for instance, which we can see here, food insecurity in Madagascar. It's actually other factors, and often compounding factors of vulnerability, poverty, the structure of societies that actually make people much more vulnerable to climate change impacts. And I thought I'd highlight this very quickly to show you also that climate science is also going into a direction where there's much more of a people-centered focus, which I'll talk about in a minute or two. But The topic of this talk is actually linking disaster displacement and attributing that to anthropogenic climate change. What do I mean by attribution? So we know that the atmosphere is changing. There are much more gases in the atmosphere we don't really want, and the overall global climate is changing. That impacts extreme weather events and the weather system in general. So we see much more intense and extreme weather events. Taking, for instance, the UK as an example, since Tobias talked about it, we had this huge heat wave this year in the UK, which was made much more likely because of anthropogenic climate change. I'm using the same concept in order to understand displacement risks in society. So if we have an extreme weather event occurring, what is the role of climate change? And if there's a climate change signal, does this also mean that people have been more displaced in quantities, have been displaced to different regions, agencies, and so on and so forth? And I think what's also important is, and this links kind of to my point I made earlier, within climate science, we're moving away, luckily, slowly, but still, from the mitigation only point, but also including interdisciplinary efforts. So not only climate science per se, but also econometrics, demography, all these kind of social science elements, which are hugely important to understand societal implications of climate change. At the same time, we recognize that collaboration between humanitarian actors, policymakers, and attribution researchers is really needed to resolve climate change statements regarding extreme weather-related displacement. And for that, it's also increasingly important to come up with counterfactual scenarios. So let's look at a world without climate change. Would have displacement occurred? Yes or no? For instance, that could be a question which could be investigated. And including a mobility dimension within climate science could also help to better understand feasible policy options, minimizing the risks of disaster displacement and social inequalities in these settings. And through migration, so kind of a migration lens, this could be one form of adaptation, but few communities are actually able to perform this adaptation measure with more and more climate impacts and more extreme weather events happening and affecting them. So there's a lack of appropriate measures to minimize these risks. And as a final point, and maybe this could start also a discussion, early actions. So if we have a weather forecast, how can we best prepare populations could be something to minimize the risk of displacement. And I think with that, I'm up with my 5 minutes, and I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much to these 5 very stimulating statements. Now, of course, they go partly in somewhat different directions, and I propose that we take at least 2 of the main issues that were addressed one after the other in our discussion. So the first 3 papers really were more directly addressing of what also is the title of our session, Population and Greenhouse Gas Emissions. So how does population change? How do demographic changes contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, or how can they help to mitigate climate change? So in other words, we're looking at the mitigation side. And clearly this discussion has been heavily influenced by this IPIDE identity that Emma mentioned. By the way, it's not only by Ehrlich and Holdren, there is also the energy community calls it the Kaya identity. There's the Japanese energy expert Kaya, who has also written quite independently the same thing. And this, of course, discussion has been going on since the 1980s, and there have been all kinds of estimations over time. And actually also in this book, Population and Climate Change, that I showed at the beginning, the 2001 book, we already address many different versions of this. So we have to recognize this decomposition that they choose is, of course, in a way arbitrary. You can choose other emitting units. I mean, they choose to nail it down to individuals, the number of people who emit, but it could be states, it could be, I don't know, like for instance, what do you do with all the greenhouse gas emissions caused by military action? And so can they be directly attributed to individuals? Probably not. Or even if we sort of have the household level consumption, then it actually has been quite some papers looking at I hat instead of I PET, where H stands for households, because after all, it's mostly the households that are the emitting units. Like we have the refrigerators, the number of cars. The number of cars does not double if the household has an additional child or 2 children. It's really household specific. And that also changes the dynamics over time quite significantly. And this is really what Dean reminded of. We really have to look at the time trajectory. For instance, if fertility goes down, then we have more rapid population aging. The elderly are still there, and the empirical data show us that old people rarely move out of their existing house. They then often just live alone in a big house. They have a lot of energy consumption. Also, they are older. So if you look at households, the demographic variable comes out quite differently in the trajectory over time as well. So I propose, and also just to mention the first paper by Jan van Weeren, it's also in a way like you're looking at the ecological footprint and also population being a main driver at a given aspiration for reaching a HDI of 0.7. And so again, this is sort of the drivers. And when we discuss this now, I really also would encourage you to look at this time trajectory. Because we're now having goals, at least in Europe, to be carbon neutral by 2040 or 2050 in different countries. Well, by that time horizon, demographic changes now induced by lower fertility may not be visible yet because of the great momentum and because of, I said, also these changing household compositions. Actually, there are also data showing us that young couples without children, they travel more, they have more disposable income, they may actually emit more than young couples with children. So in the long run, it is maybe different, then these are additional multipliers, but for the coming 10 or 20 years, where it really matters how we get down in order to keep the 1.5 or at least below 2 targets, then the dynamics comes out differently. So the floor is open for comments from each, and then we'll have a second round possibly of comments from the panelists. Thank you. Oh dear, now let's start on this side. First.
Hi, thanks very much. I'd like to ask and begin with the 3 kind of sectors that are driving emissions, which are food, shelter, and mobility. And I'm Setu Pels, by the way, from IASA. Hi. So with these 3 sectors, the IPAT model assumes a mode of provisioning that's been done in the past in delivering households access to these services, shelter, mobility, and nutrition. I'm wondering what the role of this provisioning system could have in reducing the energy throughput of access to these essential living standards for households, and how your research might inform further work in this direction about reducing that throughput for these essential living standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's collect maybe a few more and then we ask the panelists to answer. Yes, so another, yes, please.
Hi, this is Nina Brooks from University of Connecticut, and this is a little related to Tobias's presentation, but sort of a comment more generally or a question, which is sort of this difference between putting the burden of reducing the emissions on individual level choices and behavior change, switching to riding a bicycle or buying an electric car or something like this, when your car is only as green as the grid that's powering it. And so I'm just wondering if the panel can sort of comment a little bit on sort of the focus on individual choices as compared to more structural or collective or governmental choices. Thank you.
I should say the second question that I was planned to discuss then after these iPad-related questions is indeed which was the last 2 presentations addressing how do we change the beliefs and the behavior of people with respect to climate change. And this, of course, also relevant for mitigation. Thank you. So whose hand was there? Gustav, I saw your hand here.
My question refers to Madame Thalheimer. You mentioned here the tipping migration point. Could you give a definition or at least a brilliant example for that?
Any other comments? And at this stage in this first round, yes, there's Patrick.
Just want to briefly react to the first presentation as well. And I think besides the arguments that have been brought up already, also by Dean and by Wolfgang, I think there's also a big climate justice issue that needs to be addressed if you are framing kind of overpopulation and suggesting that population policy could be a measure to mitigate climate change. Because as we all know, and as you have highlighted as well, that the bulk of population growth will happen in Africa. It's the place where people are most vulnerable to climate change, and it's the place where people have done least in the world to the mess we are in, actually. And now, if you suggest population policy, it would also mean that these people have to bear the brunt of the climate mitigation efforts, which is, I think that's a big climate justice issue and a moral question we have to address.
Yes, there's one additional hand here.
Hi. I've always found it curious, and I'd like to hear comments on it, that the PAT kind of product rule for understanding impacts tends to get parsed into we should do population or we should do consumption, whereas in fact they're obviously both parts of it. It's true that you can't solve the problem of fecal contamination by making the population smaller, but it will be way easier to build all those toilets if the population's not bigger. And so I'd like to hear some thoughts on the combination of those, and in particular the fact that we now know that one of the best, most effective ways to slow population growth is increasing educational opportunities for women, which is a benefit, I think, regardless of whether we were talking about climate change or not.
Good point. So we now give our speakers a very brief time for comments and reactions. So maybe we start in the same order. Jan van Weeren, you want to?
Yes, I'd like to focus on one question, talking about behavioral changes, living car-free, no meat eating, do not fly, and so on. And there's a famous Lund study, University of Lund, that one child less is much more effective than a combination of all things you can do yourself in order to reduce your footprint. And we should take that in mind. And it's especially important in rich countries. One child less diminishes your footprint greatly.
Okay, Dean, you want to react?
I will just speak up to agree, as I understand it, with the last question, which made the observation that investing in education and human capital is probably it's certainly a necessary thing to do to improve well-being. And if that additionally has consequences over the coming decades for fertility rates, then I don't think those consequences for fertility rates are anything that we should be unhappy about. I think we should regard it as a policy priority to spread human capital and education, especially for women, especially throughout the developing world. And whatever, whether the size of the human population peaks in 2086 or 2076 or 2066, facing that future with an educated population, women and men, is going to be best for everyone. So I agree with that.
Thank you very much. Emma, you?
I wanted to address the first. I don't press. Okay. I wanted to address the first question a little bit. You were talking about food, shelter, and mobility. Was that it? So the way I see it, I'm kind of positive about technology. If we talk about iPad in this case, I think there are plenty of promising technologies within all these three sectors, especially food and mobility. But there is this kind of expectation on the big kind of electrification addressing a lot of these problems. Like, I mean, for instance, in one study we talk about vertical farming. That's basically indoors, but it's all, depending on this huge source of energy that's clean. So I'm just saying that I'm a bit positive in terms of tea in these regards, especially in terms of food and mobility.
Thank you very much. Tobias, you want to add?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to respond to 2 points, I think. So first of all, I think even if it's more important, or if it has a stronger impact to reduce population or to I don't know, reduce fertility among richer countries, the question is how to do that, like in practice, right? I fully agree that it's probably hard to implement any policies that can do that, also in light of the justice question, like who would decide what is just and so on. I think that's just not practical. This is why I think we should somehow concentrate on other things like technology as well as behavior. And regarding the question whether we put a lot of burden on individuals rather than structural things, I kind of believe it's a combination of both, right? That somehow if you have the demand for new technologies, if you have the demand for the right structures, that would help. I mean, obviously I can only use public transport if I have transport available, right? But even now, I mean, in large cities where there is like incredibly good public transport, people still drive their cars. And I mean, why would then policy invest into extending public transport, right? I mean, I think if we all do our like tiny bit, I mean, that already helps, and that will kind of like accelerate in a way that politics will also react to that. And I think that's why like every little bit that you do kind of like helps. And well, even though it might not be a huge thing, but that's the realistic option that we have, I think.
Okay, then Lisa, you want to still have a comment?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for the question on migration tipping points. As far as I'm concerned, there's not a definition in the context of climate-related human mobility. What I think are examples of migration tipping points are when voluntary migration due to extreme weather events becomes involuntary, or people cannot move, so immobility / the unpopular word trapped populations. I think these are important aspects to consider. Especially the migration tipping points, I think, have not been that much researched thus far, at least in the context of climate change. So I really appreciate that point being brought up.
Thank you very much. Several of you mentioned the education, and of course, education does not only help to improve health, it doesn't only help women to better meet their desired family size, and then typically is associated with lower fertility, but it also increases productivity and therefore income. But of course, more income can lead to more consumption on the other hand. But for this is not the education to blame, but the higher income and the higher consumption. So it's a complicated debate. But education is also related to what is sort of the second topic that I mentioned before, which is the awareness about climate change, the belief in climate change, I think it was called, because empirical data show over and over again that the better educated people, they are more able to think in abstract terms, imagining the not yet experienced, the counterfactual. And this is what we have to do in climate change. And in the CO2, we don't see it, we don't smell it, we don't hear it. We just have to believe in the scientific models that tell us that it is a big danger for humanity. And so maybe I hand over now to Shonali to moderate the second round about sort of how demographic changes are associated with such changing beliefs.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this has been a really exciting discussion. And I think one of the things it would be interesting to reflect on and to get the views of the panelists on is the IPAT's work and especially this kind of approach to looking at how emissions are related to population and technology and affluence, take a very macro view of things, right? So it's at a national level, and you're taking the average for a nation, yes? But there's a huge degree of heterogeneity within nations, and there's a huge degree of inequality within nations. And so, you know, I think the point that was made about climate justice is a very pertinent point, because the fact is we know that 10% of population contributes to 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So when you're talking about reducing population, whose population should be reduced depends very much on who is contributing the most to the emissions. So I'd really like to get your views on this aspect of the question.
Yeah. I propose we let again come comments from the floor and then go with the panelists. Yes, Eric.
Thank you. Yeah, following up on the point that Shonali just raised, population heterogeneity, this is something that I also wanted to bring up in relation to what Jan said earlier, referring to the study by the colleagues from Sweden. I think it's Seth Wines and Kimberly Nicholas. This study is also assuming the representative consumer, and I think, if I remember correctly, it's based on US American consumption data, but I'm not entirely sure anymore. In any case, they are assuming that there is this one type of consumer and all the additional children born will be like that one consumer, when in fact in the world we see a huge heterogeneity in consumption patterns, and in fact future consumers will not even be able anymore to consume those amounts that past consumers or that past representative consumer has been consuming. So I think we have to be careful with buying the main message of that article, although I think it is making a very important point. By the way, also the Bravo and Tamburini article is not considering population heterogeneity. They're also assuming one person has a specific impact and all humans around the planet are like that one person. Yeah, this leads me to my second point real quick, related to Tobias' finding, that people are not really yet responding in their behavior to climate change, and this I think has a lot to do with the felt distance to the impacts of climate change, because a lot of people in the developed parts of the world, also in the UK, for them climate change is something that is actually still quite far away. I mean, even if flooding happens around your neighborhood, the real climate change, that is something that is either happening somewhere far away or in a distant future. And here I think this links back nicely again to fertility, because within the family, for parents that have children, this future that is going to experience climate change is much closer. Yeah, those people suffering the brunt of climate change are right there in front of you, and it's much more difficult to turn a blind eye to them. Yeah, and so for that reason, propagating lower fertility or no fertility at all is probably the wrong thing. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up a bit with what Patrick mentioned and Shonali just mentioned about the number, which is the same thing that I tend to cite, that 50% of total carbon emission come from the top 10% income earner in the world. Then people argue after that, right? But then in many countries, lower income countries with high population growth, their income, probably had been stagnated for a few years, but also rising. So the consumption in these places would also be rising. And I guess the difficulty to address this question would be, I think Shonali could answer well this question actually, sort of. Then if you give everyone equal access to energy, then maybe what about cars, washing machines and stuff, then carbon emissions would rise, obviously. But then what kind of justice are we talking about then in this case? So people income rise, but they shouldn't aspire to have the same kind of lifestyle that we have in Europe or something like that, yeah.
There was a hand here and then Thomas.
Is that on? Yes. In regard to the question of how people's attitudes translate into behaviors, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the tragedy of the commons. The atmosphere is a commons, and at the individual level, if it's inconvenient for me to get the bus, so I drive my car into the city, I can say, well, I get a benefit out of that, and the the cost is spread over everybody. And it works, I think, very profoundly in my own psychology. I'm just one person. If I don't recycle that piece of cardboard, it's not going to make that much difference. And so I think this is one of the big difficulties in trying to get people to change their behavior just because of their attitudes. And if you think about things like seatbelts and cigarettes and motorcycle helmets and COVID vaccinations, none of those worked on the basis of people changing their behavior just because they knew more about the situation. It required policy interventions in all of those cases.
Good point, yes. Tomas?
To follow up a little bit on the points by Shonali and Raya about climate justice, I think there is a tension between considering when we add another person in the population, say of India today versus of a very rich country like Norway today, and the climate footprint of this person. Of course, the perspective of climate justice is clear, but I'm also thinking of the perspective of some prospective carbon footprint of that person. And if we think that, for instance, the emissions of CO2 in China more than tripled from 2000 to 2020, and I think India is now on the same trajectory, and many developing countries are on the same trajectory. If you think about the carbon impact of a baby born today in India, we shouldn't think of today's emissions in India per person, but we should think about the trajectory in the next 50, 80 years, and then the picture becomes a little bit more of concern for the babies born in India or Nigeria today.
Thank you very much. This again points to this very high relevance of the timing, how we see it. And of course, if these Paris goals are to be reached still, then of course by the middle of the century we should all have new technologies and have a behavior that is carbon neutral, and then it wouldn't matter how many additional people come. So in other words, only if we fail on the Paris goals, then of course these additional people not behaving in a green manner, so to say, and emitting more, that would then even make it more difficult. So there would be a multiplying factor due to this. But I think for the time being, we still hope that we are managing somehow to meet these goals. So should we have another round of...
Yes, I'd like to come back to the Lund study. You're right, the data of the Lund study are obsolete. They are more than 10 years old, and trends happen to change. It's the same story with the report Limits to Growth from 1972. Well, you can only work with trends, and you cannot look in the future. You cannot say, well, this will happen, that will happen, so the personal footprint of someone living in Europe will shrink. You also have to deal, for instance, with the Jevon paradox. If you produce with less CO2 emissions, you're tending to use more energy in order to produce all kinds of things. And all those trends we cannot foresee. So the only thing we can do is, well, the trend is now in that direction, and it may continue, but it may also go in another direction.
Thank you. If you keep in the same order, then Dean would be next.
Thank you. I am not really an expert on these important questions of either individual behavior or beliefs. I agree that collective action problems are, the hardest problems that we have. One thing that occurred to me when we were talking about sort of what individuals believe and think about climate change is that there's sort of an analogous question of what do individuals believe and think about population and population growth and fertility. And as population scientists, we might sometimes wonder if the only thing that the general public is more confused about than climate science might be population trends and population projections, and what sort of responsibility does that create on all of us as people in democracies or a global world. I know that the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act this past year, surprisingly, and when that happened, 2% of people in surveys said that they thought climate change was the most important issue, and so there's going to be a lot of what's going to be important is elite issues in policy making. I think if India transitions out of coal, it's probably not going to be about voting. And maybe we can do our part in this sort of public conversation as population scientists. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, Emma.
I just have a short comment on this idea of developing countries versus high-income countries, and a little bit around how development trajectories. And I think one role, as I see it as a Swedish citizen kind of enjoying this high-income lifestyle, I think there is a role in showing how a good lifestyle can be without a big carbon impact. And I noticed that Sweden is now less than average in terms of climate impact per capita. So, and I think there is some hope in terms of adopting smart technologies in the developing world, which kind of gives a good lifestyle without a huge climate footprint in terms of, for instance, using the cell phone for solving a lot of problems instead of, personal computer. So sometimes I see some hopes in terms of kind of short tracking some trajectories.
Thank you, Tobias.
Thank you very much for the nice discussion. So I'm just basically saying something on the why don't people change their behavior, because I think two people came up with this question: what is the reason for that, or some hypothesis why that's the case? And I mean, to the first point, that people might think that climate change is very far in space and in time. I mean, I see that people use that argument, but I think the results that we had in that study basically showed, well, if you have a very close climate event happening, that actually changes your view on climate change, but still doesn't change your behavior. So I think that's a bit, I'm not sure whether that explanation actually holds, because I think then you would actually need the tragedy of the commons to explain this missing link between attitudes and behavior. And obviously, I fully agree, and I think that many here agree, that it is a problem that everyone just thinks, well, my contribution is so little, and I'll just free ride and let others contribute. But maybe, as I briefly said at the end, I mean, maybe something like Fridays for Future, where actually people realize there are enough people who want to contribute, that might actually be a momentum where we can change something, and that people might be more willing to change, even though that probably needs to be determined in the future.
Okay, Lisa, you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Actually, my point is more on the climate justice point raised by Shonali and by Raya, and also going a bit to the tragedy of the commons. Just an example from the World Weather Attribution. Obviously, there are happening a lot of extremes around the globe. So how do you pick kind of the weather extreme you want to investigate? I mean, not all extreme events are created equal. So we're looking also at the impact on populations, food security, and so on and so forth. But a big driving factor is actually not the justice factor per se. It's which country haven't we looked at before, right? Because initially the whole idea was world weather attribution, looking at the global perspective, right? And also raising the point that, extreme weather events are affecting people everywhere in the world. It's not only poor countries, it's also the developed and rich countries, and we should do something. But I think having a balance of including everyone's opinion, but also being practical, I think is something we can work towards too, and also integrating different voices, like for instance from Fridays for Future, but definitely with a scientific foundation. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on Dean's point. I think you said that people are confused about climate change, but probably equally confused about population change. And in this context, like if you hear around what people are concerned about, then in the Eastern European countries, but as well as in East Asia, it's really the fear of population decline, depopulation it's called. And I mean, the president of Serbia says that population decline, depopulation is the single most important problem of Serbia. Not climate change, it's declining population, which ecologists would love. So there are some different targets, some different values, and it's really a very confused discussion here. And so maybe you want to comment on this in the audience. Yes.
Very shortly, but I think that like being from East Europe, it's like also here. My name is Karolina Sobczak-Szelc, and thank you very much for this discussion. Actually, one point here about the retirement system. And what we should be aware of, it's not only like discussion about the climate and so on, and the input of new birth or new people and the increasing number of people into the carbon emission, but also the question about how to support the retirement system. And this will happen like in African countries, there is no retirement system. And it used to be in a way simply that kids were those who were supporting their parents when they got elderly. And the more kids you have, the more supported is your old age. And more or less, it looks the same in Eastern European countries. So the huge concern of the government is that the retirement system will not be able to fulfill the needs of growing number of retired people. So as long as there is no proper retirement system for African, Asian countries, South American, sorry, then the issue of having more children, which will support you when you're elder, it will be an issue. It's only those who are wealthy and who have state position, so those who are educated, can afford not to have many children.
Great. Yes, please.
I'm Beth Fussell, and speaking to this issue of attitude change and behavioral change, the literature in social psychology has long found that attitudes don't actually change behavior, but values are more important for behavioral change. And so values are conceived as being something more core than an attitude. They're about what do you prioritize in life? And insofar as people prioritize meeting their basic needs for some of these things like food, shelter, transportation, they're going to make choices that allow them to continue to make those basic needs. And so this is why I think, picking up on Nina's point about systems, if we change systems so that they operate in clean energy, with clean energy, then people's choices will be aligned with the goals of lower emissions or no emissions. And so maybe the focus on getting people to believe in climate change and to take actions, while I think that's important, I think to accelerate the transition to meet Paris goals we should really focus more on the systems that structure people's choices to meet their basic needs. And that would apply, that would be different in each particular context, national context, according to level of development. But that's my opinion. I think the systems approach is one that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I just want to follow what Beth suggested. And I think the world, we have some good information, and sometimes the information can be contradict with each other, against each other. I think the more important is not a lacking of information, And it's more, we are under a pressure of a value system. And that's the first point I want to make. And we, if you want to make changes to the attitude, and you need to change the value system, and you have an economic system in the U.S., for instance, you have to push people compete with each other, although you know that climate change is happening, but you look careful, your own interest, and you also have the peer pressure from other people. And if you don't change the value system, you don't change the economic development paradigm, and that will be always there.
Shonali, you want to pose another question? I still have one for the end, but maybe.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've heard some really interesting comments from the audience as well, and I'd like to actually pick up on this issue of the systems need to change, because I think that's fundamental to a lot of what we're talking about. So I'd be interested in hearing about how the panelists view exactly this point, particularly because, I mean, I think we've determined, or we've heard from several people now, that attitudes don't determine behavior as much as values determine behavior. And in terms of values, choices are constrained really by your system and your infrastructure. And so, to some extent, how much of the choice is really down to the individual versus it being something that needs to structurally shift in order to make a difference. Yeah.
Should we ask the panelists again?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, if we change systems, well, I'd like to mention the case of Egypt. Egypt is at the verge of a human disaster. It's completely dependent on donor countries. Its population is growing, and they don't know how to manage it. A few years ago, there was a discussion going in the country, and they proposed to use permits to have a child. A permit for 5 years. You got a permit for 5 years to have a child, and then you had to apply for a new permit. That's a complete system change. They proposed then, that they discussed, but well, it wasn't accepted because of religious and other views in that country, but that was an example of a systems change in a country where the population was the population pressure was too great.
Dean, you want to say something?
So on the question of sort of systems or policies, I would say, versus individual choices, I think that, what's going to make the difference for climate change, as important as individual choices can sometimes be, is going to have to be policy changes. If you compare the trajectory of particulate air pollution in a place like Mexico, where it's improved, versus India, where it hasn't, I think that really comes down to policy choices. On the question that was just raised by the last panelist about fertility policy, I actually think that's an example of a case where the system didn't change, it sounded like. And I think it strikes me as very hard to believe. Well, I guess I'll say I live in Austin, Texas, and Texas is a place where access to reproductive health care and abortion has undergone big legal changes in the past year. But it's also the case that on my jogging path through my neighborhood, I already see stickers up on lampposts about how to order abortion medication through the internet or online and get it. And so, people are sort of adjusting and changing, and, population is refusing to be controlled here in Texas too. And, this is a case, of pro-natalist, anti-natalist, different directions, but there's, a long history of these sorts of policies harming people and people fighting back. And so I think we just shouldn't assume that there's really even a ready policy option that could radically change fertility rates.
Thank you. Emma, Tobias, you want to say, but you're not obliged, but if you want.
I have a short comment. I think I believe in structural changes, but I do think that consumers have a role in leading the way and just showing how a different world is possible. For instance, imagine a meat tax, and I think it would be repugnant to a lot of people 10 years ago, or it's probably repugnant to a lot of people now, but at least now consumers have sort of enabled the possibility of plant-based meat. So there is something to eat if you're not to eat meat, thanks to kind of consumer movements in that direction. People are vegetarian to a much larger extent now than before. So I personally believe in structural changes, but I'm just saying that there is some role for consumers.
Yeah, I basically fully agree with that opinion. I think that kind of like it's a bit of a chicken or egg debate as well, like what is more important, individual behavior or systems. I mean, you need the structural possibilities to change behavior, but you also need the attitudes or values that lead to systematic changes, right? So I think both is necessary, and we need to be sure that we don't think that, like, well, it doesn't matter how we behave or what we think. I mean, that also might affect the system, and that might affect how policy reacts, and that's important, I think.
Lisa, you still want to add something?
Yeah, just to add, I think Tobias is completely right. I don't think there is only a top-down or a bottom-up approach, but something which combines both would obviously be ideal. I haven't found kind of the silver bullet yet in my personal research, or how we can tackle these problems. But I think it's important to keep the ears open and also be accept other people's opinions. I often find this very difficult in research, especially in interdisciplinary research, that people are not really aware of systems and thinking in systems. So I think this, like, for me, kind of my personal experience addressing climate change actions or climate change research, thinking in systems has changed my personal research, and I think it's important that this drives my personal decisions towards climate change action as well.
Well, thank you. If we sort of agree that it does not only take individual behavioral changes, but also systems changes, it was said policies need to change, need to be implemented. They range from carbon pricing to whatever. But the problem is in democratic societies where you cannot hope for an enlightened dictator who imposes these laws, but we have elections, then probably the most consequential individual behavior is which party you tick on election day. And sort of governments, if there is a majority in the population that doesn't like carbon taxes, probably governments will not implement carbon taxes. So we are back to the opinions of people, to the values, and so this is really sort of a trap in a way in which democratic societies are there, and it's only enlightenment, not just of the people in power, but enlightenment of the entire demos, as we say, the population in a democracy. And how do we get this? Okay, this is the question.
Hi, Bronwyn Wake, Nature Climate Change. I wanted to throw something else into the mix here because we're talking about individual behaviour and government policy. But what do you think about the role of businesses that can be multinational and so on? Because we've seen so much movement and so many companies have net zero policies and they are putting pressure on and leading the way. So I think that's another aspect that we need to consider, and that can be a way that the demos in a way has a voice.
Yes.
I'd like to address that question by looking at that the majority of the population is in the working class. And I think approaching them with further taxes and already constrained circumstances is a recipe for failure. You can't sell the person who's struggling to meet their rent a further tax for the climate. It's just not something which is their priority. And I think to reach them and to have this democratic shift, because we are in a democratic society, we have to sell them a future which is aligned with their values. Actually, already what you were saying before, that we have to sell them a future where the systems enable them to have a decent life that doesn't cost the climate. And at the moment, just throwing a tax onto them is just going to end up failing again and again.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, Jordan Klein, I'm a PhD candidate at Princeton, and I wanted to bring this back to actually our talk that we were having yesterday about how pretty much all of the major actions we can take as far as climate mitigation go have these health co-benefits. And some of them are, you know, a lot of these very clearly system things as far as ambient air pollution and the way we generate power being, you know, a very one of the leading causes of death in the world. But then also some of them are these very, you know, more individual or consumer choices as far as, you know, our diets and ways that we, and diets and modes of mobility. And so a question I have, you know, kind of based on this discussion that the panel's been having is like, where are these systems changes important and where is individual behavior important is when we integrate those questions of like these health and lifestyle co-benefits as well. Is so like, you know, what can we do as far as like, you know, changing diets or like, oh, you know, whether or not people bike to work rather than, you know, choose a more emitting form of transportation. Thanks.
Let's have one or two last comments, and then I think we have to draw this to a close.
I think this can to do with a lot with our education system, and so people are educated in this kind of a development paradigm, and as an example, like the Chinese, my generation, and we grew up poor, then we are educated and aspirate to improve our standard of living and to have large houses and luxury goods like the US model. And that's I would not say that's a wrong education type of education, but we can make some changes, and the younger generation will not the same will not be think exactly as our education.
Thomas.
Thank you. I think I see a really big role for our scientists for somehow shaping and structuring this kind of directions where we can move on future action, and I see it in 3 different dimensions. I see it in first giving an advice to the government about technological changes which give the best return for a given investment for mitigating climate change. I think we have a super big role also in helping to shape economic incentives, which again cause the least possible pain for people for getting the biggest possible gain in reducing the emissions. And at the same time, I also think we can also inform public discussion and perception of individuals where relatively small behavioral changes in personal behavior bring the biggest outcome. Sometimes I'm fascinated by people thinking that when they, you know, reduce the use of plastic bags in the shops or bike a few times a week, a few kilometers, that they make a big difference. But then I see the same people traveling to Seychelles on flying with the whole family and completely, you know, making 20, 50 times bigger impact than switching from little plastic bags to reusable bags. So I think if we are able to give very clear advice and information about where all these efforts and investments can be done from government to individual level, there could be a nice impact in the next decades then.
Thank you. Shonali, you want to give some concluding comments? I think our time is over.
Yeah, our time is over, but I just want to give a shout out to 2 online participants who did put in questions, and we haven't had the chance to answer those. We've unfortunately run out of time, but thank you, Martina Siskova and Sam Sellers, for your questions, and I hope you may be able to reach out to the panelists or to us later, and we can continue with this discussion. But with that, I just want to thank all the panelists online and in person for being here and for engaging in this really exciting discussion.
Thank you.